In America, each person has unalienable rights. Yet what happens when these rights are challenged? This petition holds names of people who, though not allowed to become American citizens, did one of the most American things possible. They fought for their rights in the face of adversity. Through grit, collaboration, and their knowledge of the American legal system, these Montanans stood up to injustice. In January 1897, the Chinese community of Butte, Montana, faced a boycott that threatened their livelihoods and very existence. Butte's Chinese showed agency and power by fighting for their rights. During the 19th century, the world came to Montana. Germans, Irish, French, Chinese, and more sought wealth in the gold fields of Alder Gulch. Initially, the Chinese worked in mining, but once they were legally barred from this occupation, they transitioned to running laundries, gardens, and restaurants. Chinese immigrants often faced discrimination through anti-Chinese rhetoric, boycotts, and unfortunately, violence. At the federal level, legislation barred immigration and made it impossible for Chinese to become citizens. The city of Butte featured the Rocky Mountain region's largest Chinese community. Butte's Chinatown featured shops, restaurants, gardens, and laundries, which served both Chinese and non-Chinese customers. However, some resented the Chinese presence. Labor unions were an integral part of Butte's life, and these labor unions were often anti-Chinese. This pronounced most greatly during times of economic downturn. The Panic of 1893 destabilized Butte's economy. Across the nation, more than 15,000 businesses and 500 banks closed, and unemployment reached almost 20%. Those impacted blamed the Chinese for undercutting wages and called for a boycott. Attempts to boycott the Chinese had occurred in Helena, Anaconda, Missoula, and previously in Butte. These attempts failed due to the necessity of services provided by Montana's Chinese. The unions knew they had failed in the past, so if they were going to boycott again, they would have to be more concentrated and aggressive than ever. In late 1896, representatives from the hotel and restaurant keepers, leading steam laundries, and the Cooks and Waiters Assembly formed a committee to plan the boycott. The Silverbow Trades and Labor Assemblies distributed flyers and paraded a wagon around town, alerting the people of Butte to stop patronizing Chinese businesses. Many did not wish to comply. However, these people faced boycott themselves, like Mrs. George Altoff, who refused to fire her Chinese employees. A few days after she made it clear she would not comply, this flyer began to circulate. Mrs. Altoff was forced to fire her Chinese workers. No one could withstand the influence of the unions unless they wished to lose their livelihoods. Walking delegates roamed the streets, intimidating Chinese laundrymen and gardeners. They stood outside of Chinese businesses, preventing customers from entering. One customer recounted this experience. They said to me, "Don't go in there, we have a boycott on the Chinese. Go someplace else and eat." If I went in there, I would be boycotted myself. Look Jim, a Chinese gardener, testified that two men had stopped him and told him to leave town, then intimidated his customers into ceasing their business with him. Before the boycott, he sold as high as, quote, $30 to $40 a day, but after the boycott was declared, hardly sold anything. Even union members themselves were sometimes targeted. One union member recounted his anxiety at being seen entering a Chinese doctor's store. "I was scared when anybody seen me when I go into the store, because they would fine me for it, if anybody seen me from the union." The Chinese community knew this boycott was different. It was gaining traction and hurting their businesses at an unprecedented rate. It became clear that their community's existence was at stake. Butte's Chinese resolved to fight for their rights. Quan Loy, a leading community member, appealed to the city for help. Quote, "Our people pay licenses and taxes and poor taxes just the same as other people, and the walking delegates prevent them from trading, and I think the city ought to do something." When the city refused to help, the Chinese had only one option: a lawsuit. For guidance, Butte's Chinese reached out to the Six Companies, a Chinese benevolent association in San Francisco. The Six Companies responded, "You are crazy to go against labor unions and the American law. Though told victory was impossible, Butte's Chinese would not give up. Leading community members began to organize. They gathered funds and circulated a petition which amassed hundreds of names. They hired one of the best lawyers around, Colonel Wilbur Fisk Sanders. Sanders had an impressive career in law and politics. A radical Republican, he had supported a strong federal government and abolition of slavery. Due to his political stances, he was certainly no friend of Butte's labor unions. On April 15, 1897, Hum Fei, a leading restaurant owner, and Hui Pak, a well-liked doctor, took the responsibility of bringing suit against 22 union members who had perpetrated the boycott. The next day, Judge Hiram Knowles issued a temporary restraining order, barring the unions from continuing their activities. Whether this order would be made permanent would depend on who won the case. This case meant everything for Butte's Chinese. If unsuccessful, it could mean the end of their community and send a message to other cities that they could employ similar strategies to target the Chinese. Hum Fei et al. Versus Frank Baldwin et al. Began on February 24, 1898. Hundreds of witnesses testified to the actions of the boycott. One Butte resident gave an account of the wagon that the boycotters drove through town. Quote, "One of the representations was of a Chinaman making bread and holding a rat or something over it. Another was a Chinaman doing up a white shirt, and he was spitting water or some fluid onto the white shirt." The Chinese themselves testified to the impact the boycott had on their businesses. Don Len, a friend of Hum Fei's, explained the boycott's effect on Hum Fei's business. As soon as all these walking delegates kept there in front of his house, his business dropped 9 out of 10. Hum Fei testified that a walking delegate forcibly removed a customer from his palace cafe. The man had been assaulted and warned not to return. Hui Pak, the Chinese doctor, testified that customers feared coming into his store because a walking delegate might see them. Newspapers in Montana and beyond covered the proceedings. Many considered it to be a test case. The Phillipsburg Mail stated, quote, "Should the labor unions be victorious, the leprous dope fiends will have to be let go, and should the pigtails be successful, they will, in all probability, force many American citizens to quit certain lines of business." However, it was not only anti-Chinese groups looking on. If the Chinese succeeded, it would send a message of power and agency to similar communities. Newspapers across the West closely followed every development of the legal battle. Whenever there was new evidence or witness testimony, newspapers took note, and as a result, people from state to state watched as the case proceeded. After 3 years of extensive legal battle, the final decision was issued on May 18, 1900. The restraining order preventing the boycott was made permanent. Again, newspapers across the West took notice. Many anti-Chinese forces were aggravated at the result. However, others were impressed that the Chinese had won. It was a tremendous victory for the Chinese. They had been told it was impossible. Initially, the 6 companies had said, "You are crazy to go against labor unions and the American law." Once the case was over, the 6 companies reportedly said, "The Butte Chinese are the smartest in the world." Their victory had effects far beyond Butte. The message that the Chinese would not submit to injustice was spread across the West. Using the same American legal system that was often targeted against them, Butte's Chinese residents had saved their own livelihoods. However, the greater significance of their victory was that they had shown to the world that when their rights were challenged, these Montanans would fight for them.